Hello, today I'm speaking with Ryan Slabaugh, General Manager of Acres USA, as well as Sarah de Levesque, Director of Events and Media at Acres USA. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan and Sarah.
Thank you for having us.
Great. So Ryan, I suppose to start, could you tell us a little bit about Acres USA and your role there?
I'm the General Manager and Publisher of Acres USA. We're a 50-year-old media and education company that teaches farmers about soil health and really anybody about soil health. The core of our audiences are farmers and agriculturists around the world, both livestock, ranchers, growers, and anybody who's using soil to grow plants can pretty much benefit from what we're doing. So we started almost 50 years ago in Missouri, and now we reach just thousands of growers of all types around the world.
And Sarah, a little bit of background on what your role.
Absolutely. Yeah. I head up events for Acres USA. So including our 45-year-old EcoAg conference and trade show, which gathers our farming community together each year in December. And then I also head up a brand new organization, a sister organization to Acres USA called Regenerative Food Systems Investment, which focuses on bringing together the folks that are looking to invest in the regenerative food system with those that have investable projects.
And over those kind of last 50 years, how has Acres USA kind of changed and responded to the changing kind of food landscape?
I think ultimately we're trying to find the base level science to help farmers really build trust in soil health as a system to build their business from economically. That through the years has gone through several, different iterations, everything from, radionics to biodynamics to earth energies, has circulated in our world. But in the end, it's all based in Albrechtian, a guy named William A. Albrecht, who established really the base level understanding of what calcium and nutrients work together in the soil and how those feed plants. And, as Sarah mentioned, our conference was just last week in our 45th, and we actually had one of our speakers who's certainly part of this next generation of agronomists and consultants talking about how much we needed to update that and how we still need to provide more information about what biology is doing in the soil with chemistry and what soil structure is also allowing us to do with our plants around the world. So we are still just learning so much about soil science and soil health. And I think that's really where, our mission hasn't changed and what we talk about necessarily hasn't changed, but certainly we keep updating it. And certainly, we have podcasts now and websites and certainly things that didn't even exist 50 years ago when we started.
And in terms of those kind of events that you had last week, I suppose, could you get into the specifics, Sarah, of exactly what was covered and the kind of interest and the different kind of speakers involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously in the new world that we're living in 2020, it looked a little different than it has in the past. So it was all done virtually online. We had some of what we call our conference all-stars, some of who include Dr. Don Huber and Gary Zimmer, and they really talk about both the chemistry and the nutrients and how they apply to the productivity in our soils and our plants. But we also cover things like the intersection between soil health and ultimately human nutrition and human health. We covered things like Ryan was mentioning, soil testing and how the tools that we're using are evolving now and need to continue to evolve as we learn more about the soil. What am I missing, Ryan?
I don't know if you were missing it, but it certainly made me think that really the big question we were trying to answer this year is how do we prove that the food we're growing with more healthier soil and in healthier ecosystems is actually healthier for humans? Common sense would point in that direction, but consumers need proof and need hard proof. And I think farmers need hard proof as well. And so I think that's, Sarah, what Dan Kittredge is doing and those others that you've worked with on the investment side of kind of developing those tools. It's still kind of this where I feel like is on the consumer side and, from phone apps to just in marketplace stations to check the health of food, hopefully will be coming online in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a couple of different systems there earlier, Ryan, the move from dynamics and organic and all those different kind of approaches. And, when I look at, let's say, the stats for the United States, only about 1% of all kind of land under cultivation is organic, for example. But there seems to be a lot more energy and a lot more money going into kind of general or more varied kind of sustainable practices today. Are there any kind of lessons we can learn from those other kind of movements in the past so that we can, have a much larger scale, a set of sustainable practices across all of agriculture?
Oh boy, how much time you got? Yeah, I think so. I think that's what we talk about a lot in our operations is what we can learn from that. And the terms we're using now and what, Sarah's event around regeneration is really the next leap forward. Organic became very process driven and certification driven. And sometimes get in trouble for talking about this because certainly we encourage people to be moving that direction with their farms and, into more soil health and into more natural systems. But sometimes that idea of certification, paperwork, bureaucracy can be daunting and challenging for the farmer. And so it's one of the things that we are really trying to apply to this next evolution of agriculture as we look at regenerating is not just maintaining and sustaining what we're doing as a base level, which is kind of what the goals of organic is to prevent things from happening that could be toxic. But it's really not motivating in certainly not in a financial way for regeneration to actually make your land better and better and better and grow and grow and grow. That grows across water policy across the country. In Colorado, we have a use it or lose it policy where farmers aren't using all their water that they're licensed every year. They actually lose the right to use it, which is a zero incentive and a negative incentive for conservation and for water management. So I think as we look at moving more of a regenerative direction, we want to make sure that it's not necessarily defined as an end point or a result, is that it's a process that we're all going through and it's an improvement process that we can continually be doing no matter where we are. And I think that's the big lesson that we're trying to apply. And
you mentioned that measurement has become a core element of a lot of things you're seeing today. So what are the specific kind of types of measurement, or how can we really assess if we're moving in the right direction in totality?
It's a good question. I mean, Gary Zimmer, who, if you have any listeners familiar with, is a Wisconsin farmer, consultant, speaker, author, teacher, and he gives a pretty compelling presentation where on either side of the stage, he's got two pictures. On one side of the stage is a bare field that's dead, very little growth in it. And then the other side of the field is a biodiverse, luscious field that's, with multiple species of insects, animals, and wildlife. And he just looks at the audience and goes, which direction are you moving? And I think that's kind of where everybody can map themselves in that journey. And that's one of the things I liked about it is it's not necessarily a score system, but it's certainly a direction. And we can certainly look at the products we apply in our fields and the tactics we're using and pretty easily identify which direction we're going with those tactics.
I was just going to say, I would add to that, just because at our recent Regenerative Food Systems Investment Forum, we had a really robust conversation around the role of technology in regeneration, which I think people can kind of go both ways, but there's absolutely a lot of companies working right now to create technologies across a spectrum that can measure things like carbon sequestration or other movement, health of the soil. And so historically, those have been, the cost of measuring outcomes has been prohibitively too expensive. So markets weren't scalable and transactable. But as more companies are working with farmers and working on developing technologies like in remote sensing, just across digital ag, we're seeing some tools that may come to market that can help farmers measure how they're doing as they move towards that regenerative.
And so you're saying with remote sensing as an example, you're saying, there's a potential to use things like satellite imagery to directly assess things like soil carbon, or do we need to use things like drones and things that are closer to the soil?
I think those technologies are being developed at both levels. So drones, sensors, remote sensing, other kinds of technologies. And I think right now, there's probably so many, and we know that not all of them will come to market or actually come to fruition and have success. But the fact that there's investment dollars going there and that they might help move markets to be more successful, that they will become a tool in measuring.
And those companies that are building in that space, those startups, et cetera, what are the kind of best business models or go-to-markets for them to target, right? Often it's quite difficult to target, the large numbers of farmers. I think there's over 2 million farmers in the United States today. It's nearly like a B2C strategy in many ways, particularly because you have these large kind of monopolized players in the space. And so, some companies will go directly to farmers, others try to have partnerships with some of the big agribusinesses. For things like carbon sensing, do you have a particular view on which might have greater success for these kind of companies?
Well, my first answer to that is one, it can be really overwhelming. So I can imagine it can be overwhelming for farmers. But the caveat to that is I think no matter what, farmers need to be engaged in any kind of ag tech that's going to market to make sure that it makes sense for them. I think the other point that I will bring here, which is not my point, it's one that Bert Glover of Impact Ag out of Australia has mentioned, which is I think the tech that's going to be most successful, is what he says, are the ones that align with methodologies and protocols of the markets that become successful. So as we're waiting kind of for the, say, carbon sequestration markets to come to fruition and see which ones will actually be successful, those technologies that align with the ones that are successful will also become successful because they'll be the usable ones and the ones that farmers need to resort to get paid.
And in terms of the idea of, let's say, carbon sequestration marketplaces for soil, I've talked to a few people recently, and there seems to be a kind of a split view about the idea whether, you could have a soil carbon marketplace of some sort where anybody could buy the credits, right? You could be, an airline like Delta, you could be, a food company like Kellogg's, and it's basically just an open marketplace and people can buy, in a kind of transactional way. Alternatively, you could have a company like, Kellogg's or General Mills put just general pressure through and mandate through their supply chain down to the individual farmers and growers to sequester soil and have basically a direct relationship with the farmer in a way that a company like Delta or a mining company couldn't really do. Do you also see that kind of distinction between those two approaches? And if you do, what are your kind of general views on which might have the greatest chance of success?
I'll answer that from my perspective, but I would like to hear Ryan's as well. My first thought is this. I think the transaction one where you have, say, the oil companies purchasing those, I think I understand the resistance to those and maybe friction against it, but I also think there might be a place for it in moving at least the needle forward and having companies work and think about carbon. But in terms of initiatives like General Mills, I think you use the word mandate, which I think is interesting. I think it's one of kind of these general operating principles I think we operate by, which is mandate might be a strong word. If they're willing to work back in the supply chain and help provide markets to make it more economically feasible for farmers to make those transition to more carbon sequestration in their operations, and that I think is really moving the needle forward, because you have to have that holistic view. Farmers need to have a market if they're going to be asked to make those changes in the way they operate.
Yeah, and I just might add to that. I think where the complexity is where I think a lot of people lose focus on it. When we talk about carbon markets and how tradable they are really still today, is they're still really kind of undefined, and they're even vary country to country, state to state, and where we are with our advancement. So it's really hard to create, a program or a system to say, here's a marketable system to apply to your farm to achieve, maximum carbon sequestration benefits in the marketplace. I think that's coming, but I think what we're really focused on is that, it really comes back to healthy food. And that's really, the sea change we want to happen is, even if they're growing, say, a large amount of fuel or feed with their land in a monoculture way, and they're able to sequester carbon, that's going to be part of the solution. That's not going to be, really a sustainable method in the long run of where we need to be. So I think carbon is part of the overall equation of sustainability and a new method of farming. But I just worry sometimes that it's a little too focused on a single outcome.
And what about the kind of cultural aspects of kind of changing the form of farming? I've said before on the podcast, I grew up on an organic farm, and we transitioned to organic when I was a teenager. My mother was head of organic standards for one of the major certification bodies in Ireland at the time. And it was, it wasn't trivial, not just, changing how you farm, but also just the mentality that my father, who, had grown up farming, and that shift and what that took. How best can we kind of culturally kind of shift some mindsets, presuming that the kind of potential financial incentives can be figured out?
Boy, that's another thing we talk about every day. It's the heart of what we're trying to accomplish. And I think we firmly believe we're not out to change people's minds. If you have a very successful, very profitable, conventional farming system, it's going to be really hard to get you at the table to say why you need to change. That said, we know that those systems are getting more and more challenging for farmers. There are more farmers looking. About 20% of our attendees last week at our conference were identified as conventional farmers, which was about double what we normally get. So that's all really exciting for us. But again, they've had to make the effort to go, I need to learn about this. And I think that's the sea change that we see happening. Maybe it's a slow tidal change, but overall we're seeing, and again, the goal is not 100% of anything. That would be a hard goal to achieve. But if we can go from your point of 1% organic or 10% of the land being non-conventional farming and grow that to 30%, boy, is there going to be an ROI behind that for human health, for our land, and for the farmer itself. So that's really what we're trying to make sure, is that the farmers who want a different model and see a need for a different model have a really comfortable place to learn from.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, I think Ryan absolutely nailed it there. But I think what we, and you may have experienced this also with your mom's operation as well, but I think part of what we like to do is just make sure that there's a level of awareness out there. And so it starts with this huge soil health movement that's going on right now, and just making sure that farmers are equipped to understand the way the soil works and how to improve their soil health. And then with that, we can move forward and keep keep looking at, okay, so what do the economics of soil health mean? What does that look like for your operation? What does that look like for cutting maybe inputs if you can use fewer chemical inputs by creating a more robust soil to begin with? Those kinds of things.
The other thing is that we're a mature industry, and I think that's a lot of how we get people to buy in is they're maybe not aware of the soil testing companies that are 80 years old, the soil consultant companies that are 100 years old. The soil health is not a new industry. Perhaps it's a small industry waiting to bloom, but these are several generations old companies ready to help farmers. And I think that maybe surprises people sometimes.
That's quite interesting. And you mentioned a couple of times the kind of relationship between the soil health, and it sounds like it's been explored recently, the idea between soil health and the health of food itself for human consumption. Where are we up to in terms of the science of that? Do we have any kind of insights in terms of how these new sustainability measures will impact, the health of our food?
I would throw in, Ryan might have a better answer for this, but I would say, and we talked about this at our conference quite a bit, and I've talked about this at the Regenerative Food System Investment Conference as well. There's a lot more research needed, I think. There is started, and I think it's not research that is out in the grand world as well as it should be, but I think there's so much more research to explore in this area, or at least get out. So that's kind of where I think we stand. And I think there's a lot of good folks working on that right now. I think 2021 will actually be a really interesting year to move towards this, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
I agree, and I'll give you a real case scenario of why it's hard to do that right now. Is because plant health and soil health is really field specific. You kind of need the same field to be growing the same food to get a real true comparison of the nutritional differences. And so you can imagine if you put all this money into turning your field organic or building soil health programs, you're not really going to create a test plot to go see what you could do with a conventional spray program just to see the nutritional difference. Rodale Institute has tried to do a lot of studies that way, and they were really struggling. And they're based in Pennsylvania, a research organization, and they really struggled to find that because they were already using so many soil health programs for years across their fields that they really weren't able to do anything measurable with nutrition in a way that they knew would resonate with the consumer. They were seeing some differences. So they actually had to go to the board of directors of Rodale and ask permission to convert a 100-year-old organic field into a conventional field using a USDA conventional spray program. And that's what they're working on right now, is to create a base level nutrition program using a USDA conventional program to measure against what they're doing, 20 feet over in the next field. So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
Yeah, I think the scale question is really interesting. And it also is applicable, I guess, to the soil health and sequestration piece. I've talked to some academics out of Colorado State and New Mexico and Harrisburg about soil health. And, often some of these kind of academic studies on regenerative agriculture in terms of soil are done on, 10, 50, sometimes 100 acre plots, but at the scale of millions of acres of corn alone in the United States. I suppose I'm quite excited to see people just get to scale and see which of basically how much carbon can we actually sequester at that level. And similarly on the health side, until we just have millions of acres planted and start to kind of see, are we seeing things like in terms of human health improving at the kind of population level, we won't potentially really know for sure.
Yeah, big question mark. I think we can kind of, and that's where sometimes, we're going to have to move a direction collectively, and the science will have to catch up with us. And I think that's always challenging for humanity. Yeah.
And one of the kind of another kind of hot kind of topics in the kind of space of sustainability is the idea of, let's say, the circular economy. And I think, Sarah, you mentioned earlier this reducing the amount of inputs into farms, chemicals of various types, fertilizer, et cetera, helps the bottom line of the farmer, is potentially more regenerative, more sustainable, and gets it more into this kind of circular economy kind of model. I suppose, what are your views on circular economy as applied to food system?
I wouldn't say I've dove into that particular term, circular economy, in the work that we've done with regenerative food systems investment, but it absolutely is part of the ethos that our community follows, I would say. I think from my standpoint, whatever we're doing, and I think this guides our work, even though we're very focused on soil health at Acres USA, is understanding that economics, ecology, and like the social outcomes are all part of what regeneration is all about. And so although Acres has been very science-based and soil-based, more and more, especially now, we are looking at, okay, what are the social outcomes? What are the economic outcomes of changing practices, anything we do in the soil, or any different practices we ask our farmers to take on from a society level, not Acres USA asking them, but.
Right. And we just published our first book, actually, kind of trying to bridge that gap after 50 years. That my environmental background came a little bit more from streams and rivers and forests, and so when I got into agriculture, I saw the clear divide between that side of conservation and what was happening in agriculture. So sometimes waste is right in the middle of where consumers in agriculture are, especially food waste and organic waste. So we published a book called Waste Between Our Ears by an Australian named Jerry Gillespie, who has developed, he's kind of known as the founder of zero waste here in the United States and created the first zero waste festival in Europe. But he's very focused on agriculture and creating profit centers out of our landfills, and sees huge economic benefit to being able to repurpose organic supplies and create incentives for companies to come in, even plastic companies to come in and repurpose materials out of our landfills. This is already going on around the world. It's just because we have so much land in the U.S., relatively speaking, we hadn't felt the pressure to do that across the board. And so he uses the term economic efficiency, and he means it to mean the exact same thing as circular economy. He connects it to the idea of, here we were as a society for hundreds, if not, centuries, where especially our indigenous populations were living with circular economies. The problem is we settled in these areas expecting to bring waste with us. And that was a really new concept. And I don't think we've ever really dealt with that in a way that we've had to. But certainly, as we know, barges filled with trash are floating around the Pacific Ocean and wondering where to park. I think that's going to be something that we have to deal with sooner than later.
You mentioned some of those kind of pressure points and how pressure's starting to come to bear on some of these things. Like, what are the primary drivers of that pressure? Is it the end consumer who's becoming more sustainably minded? Is it regulatory? I know we've had a lot of regulation in Europe, but not as much in the US in general. Is it the kind of large food businesses themselves driven by ESG pressure? Which are the kind of pressures that you think are driving most of this change?
Human health and climate change. I think when people look at the cancer rate and they see stats like 1 in 2.1 men will get cancer or be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes, that's scary. When they see what's happening to our ecosystems and what's happening at the polar ice caps, it's hard to ignore that. Those are pretty blatant, large, in-your-face things happening right now. And even if we're immune to it locally, it's happening in such a repetitive fashion now that there's really no getting away from it. And so there's really, I know there's still climate change deniers out there who really, but I just don't see that being a strong voice in policy or really collective behavior anymore.
It's an interesting question that you asked, James, because I've asked similar questions of some of our panelists when we speak with them at our events. And there's two things, because I always want to know, like, chicken, egg, like, is it the demand? Is it demand driven? Is it supply driven? Where are those pressure points coming from? And I think in my mind, in my experience, the answer is the pressures are coming in a lot of different places. And that's why I think this movement towards regeneration and soil health has kind of elevated and escalated in the last few years. The two factors Ryan mentioned, of course, I think the increasing costs and pressures on farmers with input costs is driving them to look a little bit differently at how they can run their operations. And I think consumer demand absolutely is at least putting pressure on some food companies to think a little bit different about their procurement.
And in terms of the way those kind of food companies are potentially responding, is there a place for something like, sustainable labeling at the level of the consumer? Again, we've had a lot of different types of labels over time, and we've also seen the ups and downs of ingredient labeling, just in terms of calories and human health. And that, I think, is pretty much a mixed bag. Is there anything we can kind of learn, and what are your thoughts on that level of labeling at the consumer level?
Well, I have pretty strong feelings about labeling. I'm sure Ryan mentioned it earlier, but I think we're putting a big burden on our farmers and on our consumers. So a burden on our farmers to meet different regulations depending on all the different labels that they need to get that consumers and food companies are asking for, but also on consumers to understand and interpret what those labels mean when there's so many. And so I don't know how, we already have so many that as we add more, it's difficult for me to imagine being a farmer and continuing to be a mom who buys food for her kids and understanding what all those mean. So, I think simplification in labeling would be more appropriate, at least in certification, I guess, would be my route. But do I have the answer of how we get there and also increase awareness among consumers about the benefits of different practices that farmers are using to create food? I don't have that answer yet.
Just the term sustainable itself, I think, is a good canary in the coal mine. When you look at how that word has changed in its cultural impact, and maybe we're a little too close to it right now, but it really is a challenge to put a lot of value on that term sustainable and how it's used in the marketplace. There are glyphosate, Roundup, toxic chemical companies who will have sustainably certified badges on their product, even though, just because it's a way of defining something and allowing them into that world, into the marketing world and being able to use that term. So in the, conservation, ecological world, we're always nervous as soon as a term gets popular, it's going to get corrupted. And I think sustainable is one that we're really trying to move away from as a defining term. It's certainly a great principle to have to get started. But as Jeff Moyer likes to say, sustainability is not how you would describe your spouse. You would not describe your relationship as sustainable. That would not be a compliment. So we need to improve our relationship with nature in the same way, something much more beyond sustainable.
I mean, it's very similar to kind of the word natural, right? Like that, you can call a lot of things natural, which are coming out of a test tube based on, what has basically been lobbied for by certain businesses. One way I think about a lot of this is basically just trying to raise the overall floor, right? So you're just trying to get to a minimum standard that is a lot better than where we are today, where the minimum standard across a lot of metrics is pretty poor. But you do have a lot of, lobbying against that as well. So what are your kind of views on the response of large agribusinesses who are, seeing maybe a bit of the writing on the wall with their inputs business kind of going down, the amount of fertilizer being needed going down, and are putting a huge amount of money into, new seeds, different types of genetically modified organisms, et cetera, as a primary response? What is your kind of general views on those?
I think overall it's a real positive. I want to be there to support them as much as they can to help them move their product lines into a healthier system for all of us. And I think it's just so important. I'm not here to tell anybody, and we're not here to tell anybody that they're bad people, that they're doing bad things or anything. But we really do see that change as a real positive and helping us move our food system forward overall. That getting those products out of the system is such a critical part of it. And really, it's not just about removing those products out, because you still need a system behind that. And that's really what we want to get back to, is a system, and helping farmers do what they've done for a long time, but only in the last 50 years or so, or maybe 70 or 80 years, have really lost touch with on a mass scale, is real workable local farming systems that really generate high yields and high demand for the product. When your only relationship is with the grain buyer or the cattle buyer, and that's the only customer you have, you are innately at risk as a business. And so that's, we really see both the farmers and the relationship they have with those products as needing to work together to change, because they need large scale products to apply still. The business is still evolving, and we need them working on these solutions as well, and using their marketing and horsepower to develop real biological solutions. So I don't want to rule them out. I want to invite them in and
Sure.
help them as much as we can. Yeah.
And you mentioned the kind of that local element. One of the kind of very sad aspects of farming across the developed world, it's also happened in rural Ireland. We sold our farm this year, actually, after over 100 years in the family, and nobody left to farm it. You're starting to see, just for many years, like these mega farms happening across the United States. And as those farms get larger, the kind of small towns and villages that supported those farms, a lot of them are getting decimated and have a lot of kind of problems. When we kind of think about, let's say, the ag tech industry, and I think about all the cool new things that are coming online, a lot of them are optimized for very large farms. And so, I suppose, Sarah, are there any, coming from a kind of investment lens, are there any kind of products that are coming online that would potentially kind of counteract this kind of drive towards scale that could actually help kind of regenerate some of those kind of small farming kind of towns and villages?
That's a good question. I know they're out there. I don't know that I know them. In particular, the first kind of subsector of ag tech that I think about when you ask that is maybe in the livestock sector, for technologies coming on, like a pasture map, and I think it's called fence, that helps with rotational grazing. So, technology that might still be at some scale, but can be applied to a medium or a large scale, and that is helping farmers practice a good regenerative rotation versus just grazing or farm feed fed.
We might expand technology to include business models, or at least new business models. I think that's what we might see coming on, is a little more connection between e-commerce, grocery stores, and farmers directly selling to consumers through those outlets. I don't think we're talking about, the large mainstream grocery stores that are in the chain world today, but being able to solve food deserts in a little easier way, which food deserts are really just opportunities for businesses. And generally they're there because they don't have supply lines to feed, to support those grocery stores there. So I think that's what we see happening in areas like Chicago and Denver here locally. Farmers are getting a lot more involved in the e-commerce direct-to-consumer sales side.
And some of that has been, I think, heightened, and the speed of that change has increased because of COVID. I mean, we've obviously had a crazy last 7 or 8 months. How do you think, or how has COVID kind of changed your mind, or if it has at all, about some of the things impacting, sustainable agriculture?
It's certainly confirmed the necessity of farming, right? I mean, that when we look at, we had to divide our world into two pieces this year, and certainly our work world, into essential and non-essential. And that was amazing exercise to see governments and individuals work through. But the argument about farming never really came up, that farming is about as essential as of a trade and a system in your economy that you need as anything. And so sometimes we lose track of that and we take that for granted. But in COVID and in times of war or strife, soil health, local food, and maybe Sarah could talk about this, we talked about national security last week at our conference too. It really all of a sudden elevates soil health to a different level in the conversation.
Yeah, I would emphasize that a lot of this year for us has been affirmation that what we're doing in both spaces, in Acres USA and in regenerative food system investment, is so relevant. I mean, building resilience in our food system is essential, and there's a lot of different paths you can do that with. Resilience in our business models, like some of the folks that we work with are doing, or whether it's building resilience in your farm operation in your soils. But yeah, as Ryan mentioned, one of the conversations we had at our conference last week was really all about how does soil health and how we're managing our soils relate to national security, food security, and nutritional security. We had a really great panel of experts talking about it from the on-farm perspective, from the academic perspective, from the economic perspective, and definitely from the nutrition perspective. One thing I'll also add is I was speaking with someone yesterday actually about the investor community that she works with. And she was saying, there's been like a decreased interest from her investors in conservation this year, but a much bigger increase in folks looking to invest in nutrition from the food production, from the ag investment standpoint. So I think that people are starting to connect that soil health, the whole pandemic that we're in, with just where it starts, which is our human health.
And in terms of the investment landscape, Sarah, what is the kind of best levers that can be pulled on the capital side? Is it, traditional kind of venture-backed capital? Is there more work to be done on the just pure bank financing and loans side? Is it an all of the above approach to kind of, optimize and increase the amount of money pouring into soil health solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it with the banks and finance, that side of things. That's a huge nut to crack, I think, getting more banks at the table to have that conversation with how they can support farmers that might not be doing things the quote unquote normal way or traditional way. That's huge. But there's so much innovation going into this space right now about different models and what's going to work and blending different forms of capital together. So I think that's where the opportunity is how do we blend different forms of capital together at different points in kind of the evolution of a company or of an operation to make sure that they are being able to access the finance, the capital they need to keep growing these opportunities. So we see it. I mean, at our side, we have such a diversity of funders and investors, from foundations to impact investors to, yes, VC capital going to certain space, private equity, absolutely. But one space that we'd like to see more kind of institutional investors coming in and looking at this regenerative space. That's something that we always are looking to grow. And I hope that actually this year, one silver lining can be that more of those institutional investors are looking to this space because they see the opportunity to build resilient supply chains.
And maybe government support if we're lucky. I think that's where, that can really be a game changer when you get some support. I don't expect that to happen, at least in the States, with our new USDA director who's appointed. It would be a change from the norm, I guess, at some point to do that. But it's certainly possible in the grand scheme of things. But I think that's kind of, there's certainly a private investment side that we see ramping up. But really, other than maybe a few state governments really exploring it, there's not a whole lot of traction at a government level to look at this right now. Well,
and I would add again from a conversation yesterday that these conservation innovation grants that we're seeing out of the USDA, to me, are signaling perhaps that we can move in that direction with some of those going to the regenerative space. So
right.
And I believe there was about $15 million worth of grants paid out to, I think it was 8 different organizations for soil carbon measurement back in September from ARPA. And so again, that's a drop in the bucket compared to probably what is needed, but there seems to be at least some programs that are engaging with some of this from the government side.
Good point. Good point.
I suppose also just on that, one of the criticisms I think is pretty deserved of a lot of the investment side is often investors will kind of look at some of the moonshots, and in the kind of food space, you're looking at things like cellular meat, you're looking at vertical farming and so on. What are your kind of views of those kind of much longer, more majorly disruptive technologies and the investments that are going into those today?
He asked us, Sarah.
I know. I was going to say, Ryan's probably saying, oh, dang, you asked Sarah this question. Don't get her started. And I'm not going to get started because this will be recorded and shared with folks. But I'll just say, you're right. There's been so much capital going into that space. And it makes sense. It's a new innovative technology that's put out there to solve a problem. I would just add that I would proceed with caution in the sense that some of the things that we're trying to, quote unquote, solve with those technologies, I think have the potential to bring about either equal or greater challenges, or are still not addressing those challenges. If you look at ingredient lists or inputs that might go into the production of them and actually doing the cost accounting that goes into the back end of them. I really don't want to go any further on here, but I bet Ryan will elaborate a little bit on animal agriculture.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where I think the big, replacing, if the goal is to replace livestock, let's say livestock is this huge contaminant in our world, replacing it with a monoculture soybean and grain system that would feed those types of products isn't making any progress along those lines. Environmentally, it's not doing anything for the environment at that point. So that's kind of our point, is it's not really solving the problem that people think it's solving. The other thing is we fundamentally don't see the problem as livestock. We see the problem as factory farming. Factory farming is the large pollutive factor that is causing so much, concentrated methane and other releases around, the slaughterhouses. We live in one of the biggest slaughterhouses in North America here in northern Colorado, and it's a thing, here. It's something you have to work around and live around. There's something not necessarily sustainable in that model at this point. So that's really what we want to do is we don't want to create fake meat. We want to get rid of factory farming. And that's really what we want to get the public consciousness to do. Now, that takes giving up $2 hamburgers, and that takes some sacrifice in looking at our meat supply as in a different way as we do right now. And so, it's going to be generations before we probably get there. But I don't think we really solve anything with climate change with fake meat.
Yeah, I suppose on the flavor side, there's not really factory farming in the way that you have in the United States and Ireland. And, and the finest steakhouse in the United States is poorer, I would say, than an average steak in a supermarket in Ireland because of that. And so there's a way to even kind of communicate with the consumer, the much higher quality and taste and flavor you're getting by just moving to, grass-fed at rangeland type models. But yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. Just as we finish up here, Sarah and Ryan, is there anything I should have asked you both about but did not? Sarah first.
Oh gosh, I think you covered it for me. Yeah.
Great, Ryan.
I guess soil health applies to everyone. That you don't have to be a farmer, you don't have to be a grower, you don't have to be anything. You're replacing a little part of your green grass yard with something that grows more naturally is a huge step in the right direction. If everybody would do that with 10 square feet of their yard, we'd see water usage drop across the country and soil health start to grow back at some point. So, throw away the Roundup cans in your garage. If we all can do this and we can help, it's not just about putting the burden on farmers to make this change. It's on all of us. So that's the only thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, and on the positive side, I've listened to a lot of political podcasts, and the Biden administration has mentioned soil carbon multiple times over the last couple of weeks from various kind of members of their administration. And so I'm starting to hear some of this stuff in places you wouldn't normally hear it. And similar to kind of COVID, how that has changed, everybody just presumed things would just show up at their home, and now everybody's thinking a little bit more deeply about where things come from. I think those kind of that sentiment will also help on the soil and soil health and the whole element of food sustainability. But Sarah and Ryan, this has been great. Very much appreciated. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.